The death of his former apprentice, Qui-Gon Jinn, affected Dooku deeply. Already disillusioned with the corruption of the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order itself, he felt that the loss of Qui-Gon Jinn was a definitive sign that the Jedi were failing in their purpose. So he addressed the Jedi Council with a decision already made. "The Order has lost its way," he declared in front of the Masters. "Qui-Gon was one of the few who saw the truth, and you ignored him. I can no longer blindly follow this doctrine." Yoda, in his serene tone, replied, "A great loss your departure will be, Dooku." But the Count was undeterred. "I withdraw from the Order." The name of Anakin Skywalker still echoed in the minds of the Jedi. Qui-Gon had insisted that the boy was the chosen one, but the Council decided not to accept him into the Order. It was then that Dooku, saying goodbye to the Masters, made an unexpected request. "If the Order won't accept him, I'll train him. I will give him the future that Qui-Gon promised him." Mace Windu frowned, his voice laced with suspicion. "The child has not been accepted among us, Count Dooku. He is not a Jedi." Obi-Wan was called to the council and intervened, the anguish evident in his words. "Qui-Gon believed in him. He wanted me to train him." Dooku stood firm, facing the council with conviction. "And you cannot, for you are bound by the rules of this Order. I, however, am free to fulfill Qui-Gon's promise." Windu cast an inquisitive glance at the other Masters, and the silence that followed was fraught with uncertainty. Finally, Yoda broke the hesitation. "Being trained by Dooku out of order, the best decision seems to be." Obi-Wan gave in despite his opposition, but obeyed the advice, and the Council granted Dooku guardianship of Anakin, marking the beginning of a destiny that the Jedi could not have foreseen. As he said goodbye to Anakin, Obi-Wan tried to keep his composure. "If you need me, I'll be here," he told the boy. But Anakin looked at Dooku with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. The Count placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "The Jedi Order didn't recognize your potential, but I see what Qui-Gon saw. You will be trained, Anakin. It will be more than any Jedi could have imagined." With those words, they left for Sereno, where Dooku had his palace and the title of Count. Dooku's palace on Sereno was a grand and imposing environment. Anakin was welcomed as if he were a son or a grandson, with the right to a luxurious room and servants ready to attend to him. But Dooku made it clear from the start that comfort would only be a passing illusion. "Power requires sacrifice," he warned as he began training the boy. Unlike the Jedi, who emphasized strict discipline and obedience, Dooku wanted Anakin to develop his own strength by challenging his own limits. "You will be strong because you choose to be strong," he explained, as he made the boy train tirelessly. From the beginning of Anakin's training, Dooku made a point of telling stories about Qui-Gon Jinn, his former apprentice. He recounted how the young Qui-Gon was inquisitive, challenging, and always sought to understand the Force beyond the limitations imposed by the Jedi Council. He told of his early years as a Padawan, his thirst for knowledge, and how, over time, he became an outstanding Jedi, but always in conflict with the rigidity of the Order. "He believed that the Force guided each of us in a unique way," said Dooku. "And that's what made you see your potential, Anakin." For the Count, Qui-Gon was the link between the two, a master who saw beyond traditions and who now, through his memory, was still shaping Anakin's destiny. Dooku didn't just want to train a skilled warrior, but a visionary capable of seeing beyond the rules imposed by the Jedi Order. He tested Anakin's mind as much as his body, posing philosophical dilemmas and demanding that the boy find his own answers. "The Jedi say we should have no attachments," said Dooku during one of his lessons. "But could we use attachment to give us a purpose? One that makes us fight for those we love?" Anakin, his eyes fixed on his master, absorbed every word. He felt that Dooku's lessons made more sense than Jedi dogma. In a move that directly challenged Jedi doctrine, Dooku decided to rescue Shmi Skywalker from slavery. He saw it as an experiment, but also as a way of showing Anakin that there were other paths besides the Jedi. "Watto didn't deserve to keep you as a slave," he told the young Padawan. "Now your mother will live in safety, close to you." Shmi's arrival at the palace was a moment of pure emotion for Anakin. For the first time since leaving Tatooine, he was able to embrace his mother without fear of losing her again. Shmi's presence brought new emotional stability to Anakin. Unlike Jedi training, where family ties were discouraged, Dooku allowed mother and son to remain close. Shmi, although aware of what this meant, was grateful for the opportunity to see her son grow into something greater than a simple slave or a conventional Jedi. "You have a great destiny, my son," she said one quiet night in the palace. Anakin, feeling as secure as ever, just smiled and clasped his mother's hands. However, Dooku never let this stability turn into complacency. Whenever Anakin got used to the comfort of the palace, he increased the intensity of his training, forcing the boy to push his limits. "The Jedi train in the safety of a temple," he would say. "I'll train you as a true Force warrior." Anakin was tested in incessant combat, training against real opponents and situations that simulated real battles. Dooku wanted him to master not only his lightsaber, but also his mind and emotions. Even though the training was exhausting, Anakin never questioned Dooku. Unlike the Jedi Masters, who followed strict, bureaucratic rules, the Count spoke directly to the boy's heart. "The Force does not belong to the Jedi," he said. "It belongs to those who know how to use it." These words echoed in Anakin's mind, as he began to see the Force in a completely different way. He was no mere apprentice within a rigid structure. He was someone who would shape his own destiny. Over time, Anakin began to develop a new perspective on the galaxy. He saw the Jedi as figures limited by their own rules, while Dooku showed him a freer path, where he could use his power without arbitrary restrictions. Deep down, a doubt was growing. Had the Jedi refused his training for fear of what he might become? And if so, why should he follow their teachings? The seed of doubt was planted, and Dooku's training began to shape him in ways the Jedi could never have imagined. Anakin's training was progressing at an impressive pace. Dooku noticed how Shmi's emotional support brought a rare balance to the boy, allowing him to progress with unwavering confidence. Unlike the Jedi who taught detachment, Dooku allowed Anakin to strengthen himself through his bonds, channeling his emotions consciously. "The Force responds to those who know themselves," said the Count, "and your bond with your mother gives you something the Jedi fear: true motivation." Under this philosophy, Anakin grew not only as a warrior, but as an individual with a clear sense of purpose. During this period, Dooku began to establish discreet contacts with Chancellor Palpatine. The conversations initially revolved around the political instability of the Republic and the failings of the Jedi Council, but soon became something deeper. Palpatine showed a peculiar interest in Dooku's methods and his view of the Force, offering himself as a mentor, someone who could help him expand his understanding. Dooku, always suspicious, tested Palpatine, but as their interactions intensified, he came to respect him and even consider him a key to his own path. Palpatine's influence grew subtly until, in a carefully planned moment, he revealed to Dooku his true identity: Darth Sidious, Sith Lord and architect of the shadows that ruled the galaxy. "The Force is not a chain that binds us, Count," said Sidious, his voice laden with mystery. "It is an infinite ocean, and the Jedi refuse to sail beyond the surface." Dooku, who had long questioned Jedi dogma, found in the Sith a master who offered unrestricted answers. Over time, he began to share these teachings with Anakin, gradually introducing him to concepts from the dark side without the boy realizing that he was treading a new path. The years passed and Anakin grew into a teenager whose power surpassed even experienced Jedi Knights. His mastery of the Force was exceptional, and his training made him a formidable duelist. More impressive, however, was his ability to manifest rare abilities, such as Force lightning. Dooku watched with fascination as the young man learned to channel this destructive energy, shaping it without the need for hatred or fear, something not even the most experienced Sith could do. "You transcend the divisions of the Force, Anakin," Dooku praised. "The Jedi avoid this power, but you control it." Anakin's progress did not go unnoticed by Darth Sidious. The Sith, who remembered the young slave he had met on Coruscant years ago, demanded that Dooku take him to him. The meeting took place in a dark chamber shrouded in mystery. Palpatine, wearing his chancellor's disguise, welcomed Anakin with a sly smile. "Time has shaped you magnificently, young man," he said, observing every detail of the boy with attentive eyes. Then Dooku, with a solemn tone, turned to Anakin. "It's time you knew the truth, young man. The one who guides us through the darkness is Darth Sidious." The weight of the words resonated in Anakin's mind, but he wasn't shocked. In a way, he had always known that he was exploring territories beyond what the Jedi would consider acceptable. Dooku himself had already taught him that the dark side was not an enemy, but a natural part of the Force. "I'm sure I have much to learn from you, Master," Anakin replied, his voice firm. Sidious smiled, pleased. "So, young man, you have already understood a truth that the Jedi will never accept. But there is still much more to learn." And so, the Sith planted the final seeds to shape Anakin into something far beyond what the Jedi or even Dooku could have imagined. Over time, Anakin became a complete warrior. Dooku passed on to him everything he had learned from his master Yoda, teaching him not only how to wield a lightsaber and master the Force, but also patience, strategy, and mastery of his emotions. On the other hand, Palpatine subtly complemented this training, expanding Anakin's knowledge of the ways of the dark side. The young Skywalker was not bound by dogma. On the contrary, he moved naturally between the two sides of the Force, balancing the power of the dark side with the wisdom of the light side. This balance fascinated Dooku and terrified Palpatine. For Sidious, Anakin was an unprecedented being. His ability to absorb teachings and manipulate the Force to extreme levels made him a perfect candidate to be the ultimate Sith. But there was a problem. The emotional balance that Dooku and Shmi had given the young man made him difficult to manipulate. A Sith needs to be shaped by suffering, hatred, and revenge. And Anakin, with his stability, would never be manipulated. Palpatine understood that, in order to bend the young Skywalker to his will, he had to break him. And to do that, all he had to do was eliminate the pillars that supported his equilibrium. The strategy was meticulously planned. Palpatine knew that in order to plunge Anakin into the dark side, he had to make him feel an irreparable loss and an overwhelming betrayal. So he hatched a cruel plan: kill Shmi Skywalker and put the blame on Dooku. The pain of the loss and the hatred for his master would be enough to drag him into the darkness. When Anakin was sent to Geonosis for a mission, and ordered Dooku to follow, Palpatine waited until they were both far away and secretly traveled to Sereno, infiltrating the Count's palace unnoticed. The Sith had their ways of crossing security barriers without leaving a trace. Inside the palace, Shmi was found alone in her quarters. Without giving her a chance to react, Palpatine subdued her with the Force, crushing her body without uttering a single sound. But he needed everything to look like a crime committed by Dooku. He placed on Shmi's desk a scroll containing archaic Sereno laws on warrior lineages, suggesting that Dooku wanted to eliminate any emotional influence on Anakin to make him a worthy successor. On the ground, next to Shmi's body, he dropped one of the Count's chalices, as if a discussion between the two had taken place before the murder, reinforcing the farce that the Count had killed Shmi to free Anakin from his weaknesses. Far away on Geonosis, Anakin felt a strong impact on the Force, like a wound opening up in his mind. He put his hand to his chest. His breathing quickened and a shiver ran down his spine. He knew that something terrible had happened. As soon as Dooku arrived, Anakin said, "Master, I have to get back to Sereno," he said anxiously. Dooku was surprised, but Anakin didn't wait for an answer. He followed his instinct and immediately set off for the palace. When he arrived, he found a devastating scene. His mother was dead. The atmosphere was filled with darkness, and the signs clearly pointed to Dooku. Anakin fell to his knees, holding Shmi's body, the pain becoming something he had never felt before. His eyes burned, his body trembled. Then hatred was born. Without hesitation, Anakin set off for Geonosis in search of Dooku. The Force guided him as never before. His steps were driven by a primitive instinct, something that grew inside him and consumed him. When he arrived on the planet, he found a burning battlefield. Jedi and Separatists clashed amid the chaos, but none of it mattered to Anakin. He closed his eyes and felt Dooku's presence, a signature in the Force that pulsed in a cave. Like a predator, he headed straight for it. Inside the cave, Obi-Wan Kenobi was trapped. His saber had been ripped from his hands, and his wounded leg prevented him from continuing the fight. Dooku raised his saber to deliver the final blow, when a roar cut through the silence of the cave. "Liar! Killer!" Anakin's voice echoed with overwhelming force. Dooku turned and saw the young Skywalker advancing like a storm of fury, his saber igniting with a fierce glow. Obi-Wan, still on the ground, stared at the scene in shock. Anakin? He thought that was the young Anakin who could have been his Padawan. Anakin's attack was brutal. He launched himself at Dooku with swift, relentless blows, forcing the Count to retreat. Each blow was charged with rage, and his speed was frightening. Obi-Wan, though wounded, managed to stand up well enough to witness something he had never seen in a Jedi. Anakin was not only fighting masterfully, but also unleashing bursts of force lightning between his attacks, forcing Dooku to defend himself desperately. The cave shook with each impact, rocks falling around the combatants. Obi-Wan couldn't believe his eyes. This was perhaps the greatest display of force power he had ever witnessed. Dooku resisted, but Anakin's fury was relentless. A precise blow disarmed the Count, sending his saber flying. Anakin knocked him to his knees, and with one swift movement, grabbed Obi-Wan's saber and placed it crosswise next to his own. Both pointed at Dooku's neck. His breathing was heavy, his gaze burning with hatred. "Why did you kill her?" he roared, his voice filled with pain and fury. Dooku, confused, opened his eyes wide. "Who? What are you talking about?" Anakin clenched his fists around his sabers. "My mother. Why did you kill her?" The silence in the cave was sepulchral. Dooku was paralyzed. He understood what was happening. "She's dead." His voice carried not fear, but genuine surprise. "I wasn't responsible." But Anakin didn't want to hear it. His eyes were fixed on the Count, and the force around him was restless, vibrant, wild. "Liars say that before they die," he hissed. Obi-Wan, watching the scene, knew he had to act. "Anakin, stop!" His voice cut through the tension, but the young Skywalker didn't move. He wanted justice. He wanted revenge. Dooku, for his part, was beginning to understand the trap. "Palpatine," he muttered to himself. But before he could say anything else, Anakin was ready to carry out his execution. The dark side was calling, and he was one step away from giving in completely. Obi-Wan, looking at the fallen Dooku, showing no signs of resistance or guilt, realized that something was wrong. The desperate tone in his voice was clear when he shouted, "Anakin, don't do it!" The young Skywalker froze for a moment, but was still breathing heavily. His sabers crossed against the Count's neck. "Maybe it wasn't him," insisted Obi-Wan, trying to bring his pupil back to his senses. "You're a Jedi, you can't do that. He's your master." Those words made a momentary impact, but they weren't enough to erase the anger in Anakin's eyes. Dooku, still stunned, raised his eyes to the young man and murmured, as if everything finally made sense, "Sidious, he wants you to delve into the dark side." Anakin felt a chill run down his spine, and his furious expression turned to something akin to doubt. He switched off his saber and took a step back, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Palpatine," he whispered, almost without realizing it. Obi-Wan heard and widened his eyes, absorbing the information in shock. "Palpatine? So, he's the Sith Lord we've been looking for years." The answer didn't come in words. Anakin turned slowly towards the exit of the cave, his mind already made up. Before disappearing into the darkness, he looked back and coldly declared to Obi-Wan, "I am not a Jedi." Dooku knew that the arrival of the Jedi was imminent. Still shaken, he managed to stand up and, without saying another word, headed for his ship, leaving Obi-Wan behind. Moments later, Yoda entered the cave, followed by other Jedi. "Master Yoda!" Obi-Wan turned around hurriedly. "Palpatine is the Sith Lord we're looking for." Yoda closed his eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the information. "We must warn the Council on Coruscant," he said sternly. Without wasting any time, the Jedi left for the capital, preparing for the final confrontation. When they arrived on Coruscant, the Jedi Council met urgently to decide on the next steps. It was determined that as soon as Palpatine returned, he would be arrested and tried for treason against the Republic and for his alliance with the Sith. While the Masters discussed the best approach, Anakin was already on the move. He would not wait for the Jedi's decision. He headed straight for the Chancellor's chambers, but found the room empty. The silence was deafening. Palpatine had disappeared. As he left Palpatine's room, he felt a familiar presence and turned around quickly. His eyes widened at the sight of someone he hadn't seen for years, but whose image had never disappeared from his mind. Padmé Amidala. His heart raced. In the midst of the storm of anger and confusion that was consuming his soul, that sight was like a bomb. Padmé, for her part, took a moment to recognize him. "Don't you remember me?" His voice carried a restrained nostalgia. "Anakin." The name echoed through the corridors. Padmé's eyes widened and she put her hand to her mouth. "Annie, you've grown up." The incredulity soon gave way to a sincere smile. For a moment, the two of them talked like old friends whom time had separated. Padmé wanted to know everything about him, about his journey, but Anakin's expression soon closed. The memory of his mother came as a cruel blow. With a voice laden with pain, he told her what had happened to Shmi. Padmé, without thinking, wrapped him in a hug, ignoring the armor of coldness he tried to maintain. "I'm sorry, Anakin," she said softly. "You don't have to go through this alone." Her eyes were full of compassion. Anakin took a deep breath and hesitated for a moment. "I'm going to bury my mother," he said at last. Padmé nodded without hesitation. "I'll go with you." Together, they left for Sereno for Shmi's funeral. It was a silent moment of farewell and reflection. Padmé stayed by Anakin's side the whole time, respecting his grief, but also offering her presence as a reminder that he still had someone by his side. Anakin didn't say anything, but he felt that Padmé was part of his story in a way that he still didn't fully understand. When the ceremony was over, he knew there was no more time for regrets. Fate was calling him back to Coruscant. Upon returning to the city, Anakin felt a chill run down his spine. The Force was whispering in his mind. He looked at Padmé, his eyes intense. "He's here." Padmé frowned. "Who?" Anakin looked around, feeling the energy pulsing in the air. "Palpatine." His voice was deep, laden with certainty. Padmé hesitated. "Anakin, he's the Chancellor. Are you sure?" He turned to her, his gaze charged with something Padmé couldn't define. Anger, determination, a weight he'd been carrying alone for a long time. "I know it's hard to believe, but he manipulated all this. He's the Sith Lord." The doubt in Padmé's eyes was evident, but before she could say anything, Anakin was already on the move. He crossed the corridors of the Senate and headed straight for Palpatine's chambers. But when he got there, he found an unexpected scene. Mace Windu and other Jedi Masters were gathered, ready to arrest Palpatine. The confrontation was about to begin. Palpatine, seeing himself cornered, leapt towards the Jedi Masters, spinning his lightsaber and preparing to eliminate anyone who dared to challenge him. However, before he could strike his first blow, a blast of Force energy hit him with overwhelming violence. His body was thrown against the glass wall of his room, cracking the surface on impact. The Jedi Masters quickly turned to the source of the attack and saw Anakin Skywalker standing in the doorway, his gaze burning with pure determination. His body was relaxed, but his aura emanated an overwhelming force. "You will not arrest him," declared Anakin, his voice filled with fury and certainty. "He won't leave here alive." Before anyone could react, the young man leapt up to strike the Sith with a mortal blow. Palpatine, still dazed by the lightning that had struck him, raised his lightsaber to defend himself, but was visibly weaker. The ensuing duel was like nothing the Jedi had witnessed before. Anakin advanced with swift, violent blows, his speed surpassing any opponent Palpatine had ever faced. Each strike was meticulously calculated, his mastery of the Force absolute. Palpatine tried to strike back, throwing Force lightning at Anakin. But the young man just raised his hand and dissipated the energy with an impassive gesture. His superiority was evident. Mace Windu watched the scene with a serious look on his face and then made a discreet signal to the other masters. They would not interfere. They knew that Palpatine was too dangerous to be left alive, and if anyone had the power to end him, it seemed to be Anakin. The fight continued, and with each blow, Palpatine was pushed back. Fear began to spread across his deformed face. Anakin, on the other hand, showed frightening control of his movements, not giving in to hatred, but not showing hesitation either. In one final move, Anakin disarmed Palpatine with a ferocious blow, taking both his hands in one clean cut. The Sith fell to his knees, his breathing ragged, his desperate gaze on the young Skywalker. "No, Anakin, don't do it," pleaded Palpatine, trying to appeal to any remnants of compassion that might exist in him. But Anakin was no longer a naive child. He knew who was in front of him. Without a word, he raised his lightsaber and, with a single blow, ended Palpatine's life in front of the Jedi Masters. The Sith's body fell lifeless, ending years of manipulation and darkness that had corroded the galaxy. The Jedi remained silent for a moment, absorbing the scene before them. Mace Windu finally broke the silence. "He fulfilled the prophecy," he murmured, acknowledging the young man's achievement. Without saying anything, Anakin turned and left the room, walking towards his ship. His next step was to return to Dooku's palace. There, he met his former master and, for the first time, bowed his head in respect. "Forgive me," he said, his voice laden with sincerity. Dooku watched him for a moment before replying. "You have walked your own path, Anakin, and you did what was necessary." Dooku was tried by the Senate and sentenced to prison, taking all the blame for his past actions. Anakin, for his part, was acquitted, as he had been responsible for the destruction of the Sith, and Dooku took all the blame, freeing his apprentice. In the end, the relationship between master and apprentice prevented both from plunging into the dark side forever. Anakin found his peace away from the Jedi. He returned to Naboo, where he married Padme Amidala and lived a quiet life, raising his children, Luke and Leia. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but not as the Jedi had predicted. The balance of the Force did not come from the total destruction of one side or the other, but from Anakin's choice to walk his own path, free from the chains of the Order and the shadows of the Sith.